My name is Chelsea Damon. I'm a researcher at American University as well as currently pursuing a PhD there. I will let everyone know that there's slightly different moderators on the panels that you have on your handouts, but I'm Chelsea. And we are gonna have a slightly different panel than what you've seen for the first panel. So our first guest is actually coming in via new technology, and we're gonna have Ali Fisher, who will first present his research, and then we'll go on to the two panels that are actually here in person. So I'm really excited we're doing this panel on capabilities because it's very important to understand how terror groups use new technology to create information ecology and how they disseminate and distribute propaganda and form ideas in the virtual sphere. Also, the idea of disruption and how we can disrupt these capabilities potentially is very important, and I know that is a major debate right now. So hopefully, Ali will be here soon. Do we know when he's tuning in at all by any chance? Okay, what I will do is I'll introduce Ali and he is gonna appear. So Ali Fisher is an explorer of extreme realms at human cognition, which sounds really cool. And he is part of an interdisciplinary team that works with the government and tech companies to track, analyze, and disrupt the use of the internet by terrorist group. So with all due respect, let's push it over to Ali.
Thank you. Could you give me a wave if you can hear me? Ah, awesome. Thank you. So, sorry I couldn't be there in person. As Chelsea says, I work for Human Cognition, and we do a combination of human-based research and technology-driven analysis. And so in this particular presentation, we'll be talking about the project we did, looking at how terrorist information and content is shared across the entire trying to build a model of the ecosystem that exists rather than looking at just one platform or one particular release. We're trying to get our arms around the ecosystem because we think the information ecosystem is the thing that gives them strength and resilience. So that's how we approach this. So to start off, we do like a little bit of history. So this type of activity in terms of sharing content online started back in the 90s, but by the early 2000s really got going. The idea of sharing videos in multi-parts, 2005, 2006 was fairly well established, using what we'd probably commonly now talk about as like a photo report style, where you produce a report on a particular action and then maybe make a video of it and release that through a series of files, and a series of links. 2006, 2007, they were giving you different video types, different audio types, different file types. If in some of these you'll see a red tick on by some of the images, those are ones that you can still get via the links that are still being shared. So almost 12 years on, some of these still work, and some of the 2006 ones still work. Remember, that was the year that Pirates of the Caribbean: Dead Man's Chest was #1 in the box office. So it's been around a while, this type of thing, and certainly using file sharing has been very common. By 2008, just a normal way jihadi groups operated. 2009, they started sharing URL that were clickable within their PDFs. So this was a magazine that had recollections that if you click the link in the PDF, you could get the video. 2 of those still work 10 years on. And then the sort of classic, what we think of as the classic, the links being shared in forum 2010 video that has a very similar theme to a lot of the videos that we see at the moment. This one is basically victory or die. So they're all not only still available, but the method that they used and refined during that period is the method that's important now, in the sense of their history and technological evolution is how they've got to this point. They didn't just arrive at their current sharing. And the reason we emphasize they tend to get to sort of 2014, ISIS suddenly, is it really important? Well, okay, but 2010, video released, Follow the Caravan. You could just get it, click on the link in the magazine. 2011 to 13, plenty of the groups that currently use Telegram or establishing themselves on Twitter, particularly. A majority of them, kind of the uptake was 2012, but 2011 some of them. And by 2014, what we think of now as the current problem was well established, with Nusra largely leading the way, using what we would normally think of now as the platform. So YouTube, just based at archive.org, Gulf-Up, and a little bit of Facebook. So given that they've been doing that for the last, at least 13 years, and that in recent times there's been responses, we were thinking, well, how has it evolved? And so how is it that, given the current approaches, they're able to still do things like the examples here? So this was one of the small elements, the small sections of the speech that al-Baghdadi gave a while ago, not the recent video. 138,000 views on one video. That's more than Salil al-Sawarim 4 got when it was originally posted on YouTube in its first release, and that was probably one of the most successful of the ISIS releases. But how is it that they can do that in 2018? Part of the answer is that they've evolved to drive traffic from one platform to another, rather than it being, we're going to put it on a platform and try and get the people on that platform to view it. So the other part of the example here is the comments they'll post. This one came from a YouTube video where it's actually sharing links to other content, and also giving a suggestion of how you would search for it and the terms you could use to search for content. So that's in the anecdotal realm of how they're still being able to operate when there's more emphasis on content removal and disruption. So the project built on that sort of 12, 13 years evolution to understand what they've been up to. And what we used was the data we collected using our collection system, which gathers the data in near real time, comes basically from the core of the jihadi groups on Telegram, where you've got to be able to pass as a fluent Arabic-speaking jihadi to get to some of those groups. So that's at the human end, and then once you pass to get into those groups, we use the technology to absorb the content that we're sharing, which gives us the capacity to share those URL in near real time, or to warn people, but also on the other hand to do research like this, where we'll understand what they're sharing and how they're sharing it. We chose to focus on short links because we wanted to be able to understand the flow of the ecosystem. Short links are fairly helpful and slightly unusual in that respect, in that some of them will tell you who's sharing the where someone's finding the content and where they're leading you to. So you can build a network graph of the content and the flow across the ecosystem. And what we did was we took short links that were shared within the jihadi core on Telegram. Of those links, we filtered out the ones that were extraneous for one reason or another. Often, or occasionally, they were sheer militia that had penetrated one of the groups and then tried to flood it with other content. So we had to take those out first, so that we only got the content that was either produced specifically by jihadi groups or was important to them. There was a little bit of a area there. And of those, we end up with about 1,600 links, which collectively got 1.8 million clicks from about 150 countries and territories. The important bit of all that is that the flow across the ecosystem comes from the sort of 700-ish platforms broad to encompass all types of social media, file sharing, and your classic websites. Having done that, that kind of gave us the picture of the ecosystem. We were able to look at the network as a whole rather than look at a platform within it. And what we find is that once you know the sources of the traffic and the targets of the traffic, you can understand the different roles that they play. We've got the beacons, those that tell you where to look. You've got the aggregators which collect content together, and so once you've got one link, you can then access a load of content. And then what we refer to as the specific content stores, which you access one file. So whether that's file streaming or file sharing, whichever. Sources and targets. Sources obviously are basically the beacons, and again you've got mostly platforms with high reach. So Facebook, the Telegram, F-Droid is just a Telegram adaptation for Android, and then Twitter and Google Plus, some of the others. The content stores, you get IP addresses as well because they were hosting some of the aggregators were self-hosted. After a while, they stopped using a domain name or a host name and just used the IP address instead because it was easier and harder to disrupt. So those are your content stores and aggregators. Equally, if we look at it through the network metrics and use different type of network metric, we can show called a key actor graph, but those that are authoritative within the network, those are your kind of your core locations, and then your bridges or conduits. Those are important where you would flow in and out of that platform, so they give some form of bridge between content. Telegraph's really important for them now because that usually is something that they'll share one link, and then when you land there, you can get a series of other links to other content. The reason that we kind of talk about that is because although we hear a lot of discussion about a platform has content on it, it's only realistically a problem because of all the other platforms. Because if you can hide a file somewhere, it's no good unless you can tell everyone where it is. And equally, it's being a beacon is not a great problem if there's nowhere to hide the files. It's because they interact together that gives them both the resilience and the ability to share large files and invite people to certain chats and groups. So our main finding from that in terms of their capability is that they're very resilient because they have a lot of platforms that do different roles within the information ecosystem. One question we got asked was, is it still available? Broadly, yes, a lot of it is still available. Ton of documents, videos, and those collection aggregator type content was all still available when we checked, which was something we did later because of a question in the feedback. Of the 1,600 or so, over 600 didn't give you any response at all, which means that the server was no longer there or the server was no longer responding to that IP address. Usually the self-hosted stuff, and then a series of other code responses. 200 just means, yeah, it's working, it's there. 404 means the platform's still there, but that specific file isn't. And there's a difference with 451, which is a possibility of using in future more, is saying it's unavailable for legal reasons. We've actually removed it rather than you've typed the URL wrong. The 404 you could have mistyped rather than actually it's been specifically removed. All in all, basically, most of the content that was stored is still there, which brought us to our sort of final thoughts, which are, on a practical level, it is possible to take the content, the URLs, the specific URLs that are being shared within core jihadi communities and report them to those platforms. Some of them we've recorded in under a second from them being shared with the community. Normal conditions, it's about 10 seconds. So it's we can have a big impact on those that sharing if we can coordinate enough in terms of being able to report the content to the appropriate platform. The second part of that is, because we know that link sharing happens across platforms, there's perhaps a greater shared awareness that also needs to be happening. Most platforms, speaking in general terms, are concerned about finding the content on their own servers. Here, what we're talking about is sharing the link somewhere and storing the content somewhere else. So it's harder to identify, but if you can just penetrate the core network, as we did for this, you can immediately report and share those URL within a second. Two final points, which perhaps one of them refers perhaps slightly more to a European context, is legislative clarity. To be able to do some of this stuff, certainly within Europe, there needs to be a clarity from policymakers about what is private and falls under privacy protection and what falls under the requirement to remove content that may be considered terrorist or illegal. And finally, we mention clean hands. It's all very well turning up and talking about content removal, but if you're also posting it on Twitter yourself, it's probably lacking some credibility. So we kind of encourage those that are working to remove it not to be also working with people who are sharing it on Twitter and other platforms. So those are the comments where we got to. Chelsea, back to you.
Thank you so much, Ali. And we're crunched on time a little bit, so we're going to have Paul Gill, who's our next speaker, come up and talk about his research. And Paul is an associate professor at the Security and Crime Sciences at the University College London, and he has numerous publications and he's done fantastic work for many grants. I'm not going to rattle them off, and due to time, I'm going to pass it over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Chelsea. I'm just trying to find my slides. They're yours, Stuart, yeah? That's mine. Okay. Give it a shot, yeah? Okay. I've never followed a self-identified explorer for a talk before, so this is quite intimidating. So we've been doing some research on content removal on online platforms. A lot of our research over the last few years has been particularly focused upon violent extremist risk assessment, so the assessment of an individual as opposed to the assessment of a single piece of content on a social media piece. We've been conducting interviews with members of GIF-CT, policymakers, strategists belonging to these social media organizations, as well as individual practitioners from national and European internet referral units, really sort of focusing on the kind of process of how this kind of triaging and assessment works from site to site. And specifically what we're really interested in is that sort of division of labor between the sort of human coders and sort of machine learning between the two of them, right? So the interviews lasted between 20 minutes and 60 minutes. The interview protocol is available on the Open Science framework, and the sort of 6 key themes emerged from our sort of qualitative analysis of the transcribed interviews. We'll very quickly walk through them because we've only got 7 minutes in total. So the first one is that there's sort of very divergent approaches to content removal across the different platforms that we're looking at, but can be summarized in 2 main modalities: content-based analyses, which look at the sort of linguistic tone or content of the actual message itself or the piece of propaganda, versus more sort of behaviorally based analyses, which look at If it's looking at an account, it will look at the posting style, posting tempo, the length of time that the account has been operated for, who it's following, things like that, right? So it sort of harkens back to that very kind of crass debate in trying to understand the role of ideology in violent extremism. So do we need to understand the content of a message, or do we need to understand the sort of behavior that underpins the transmission of that message itself? Human content moderators are used across the board in each one of those things, and really it's a problem of scale. For very, very large organizations, they can employ upwards of hundreds into the thousands of content moderators. Obviously, that isn't necessarily something that's available for your smaller social media organizations because of budget constraints, and they also can't conduct those more automated behavior-based analyses because they don't have maybe the engineering infrastructure behind it to be able to sort of do that more automated machine-based approaches. Obviously, it's been mentioned a few times already, one of the sort of main challenges that they have in assessing a piece of content is because of the sort of broad range and spectrum of potential violating contents that is characterized by violent extremist propaganda. Donald Holbrook has done some fantastic work over the last few years trying to sort of build these different grades of extremism within different individual pieces of propaganda, but drawing that line about where it is that we're going to start policing its availability on these places is a lot more difficult than, say, in areas, analogous areas, say, in child sexual exploitation and so on. There's a lot bigger, grayer areas here. Also, from platform to platform and organization to organization, they use varying different definitions of terrorism. It's not just a problem with academics, it also happens with social media organizations, whereby some organizations would deem something as a piece of terrorism and take it down, whereas others might look at an act of violence that didn't target civilians and didn't have fatalities as its main intent as not terrorism, it's something else, and it might get to stay on the platforms. Something that sort of consistently emerged across the interviews was the importance of these policy guidelines, and Erin very eruditely, far better than I could, talked about some of these issues already this morning, so I won't spend too much time on it. And really, one of the issues, it sort of emerged a lot when we interviewed policing practitioners, you know, so they would be worried about a certain set of content because it evoked a certain set of risks for them from a policing perspective, but they would have to sort of package those referrals to make sure that it met that it had violated the terms of service for those social media organizations itself. This is also something that's kind of analogously going on right now in the sort of general violent extremist risk assessment world outside of online internet forums, where various different stakeholders and practitioners in the UK at least have a mandate to refer their sort of concerns for violent extremism in their populations. And there's some interesting work going on there about what is it about a referral that makes the next organization take the referral seriously. So again, there's sort of other avenues for future research. As I said, the human element was sort of consistent and ubiquitous right away across these various different organizations that we interviewed. The smaller scale operations reported no sort of automation, again, because it's an issue to do with finances and to do with scale and to do with, you know, competing priorities when they're sort of a small startup. But really where we felt that came through in the interviews that humans are really, really important is for that particular grey area, right? So psycholinguistics has made some really, really phenomenal leaps forward. Computer science has made these leaps forward in the last few years. But often their assessments kind of lack that sort of cultural nuance or humor or satire or the sort of things that a human expert could pick up on in a sort of given piece of text that the machine falls way back on. Humans are also a lot more kind of malleable and adaptable to being able to spot quicker those kind of changes in the operational tone of terrorist propaganda, right? Whereas the machine is often much more slower to react to these kind of competitive adaptations on the online space. And the next one is the sort of related to the base rate fallacy. So even if we have a kind of an automated tool which has really, really exceptionally high accuracy rates, let's say it judges terrorist content 95% of the time correctly and non-terrorist content 95% of the time correctly, it sounds pretty good, right? Like it gets it 95% of the time right. The problem is that non-terrorist content far outweighs terrorist content on all of these online platforms. So let's just say if terrorist content is 1% of it, really the accuracy rate goes down to about 16%, given the sort of variance in the number of online things that are content that's available. And then finally, you know, again, some of those discussions focused around the grey zone and that sort of consistent debate around freedom of speech versus the fear kind of being seen to be overly censoring the material that's on there. And again, there's some sort of thoughts that we got from the interviews, that was when it was sort of deep in that particular grey zone, that there was a tendency to err towards freedom of speech. I think, you know, moving forward, if there's going to be some sort of research, and again, this is going on in the wider kind of risk assessment domain, about how can we sort of build tools and systems that triage and assess these pieces of content at different units of analysis, right? So it sort of works as a funneling system, and each one of those parts of that system uses different indicators to sort of remove that problem of false positives and false negatives. That's it for me. Thanks very much for your time.
So our next speaker is Stuart McDonald, and he is a professor of law at Swansea University in the UK. And his research interests lie in criminal law, counterterrorism, and particularly cyberterrorism and the use of the internet by groups. So welcome, Stuart.
Okay, thank you very much, and good morning. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the co-authors that also contributed to the study I'm going to be presenting. So 2 of my Swansea colleagues and also a colleague from Cardiff University. As a group, we did an earlier piece of work that sought to look at Twitter's effectiveness in removing the magazine of Islamic State from its platform. And in that earlier piece of work, we found that Islamic State had largely resorted to the use of throwaway accounts. And these throwaway accounts that were used to disseminate the magazine had low numbers of followers and were suspended quite quickly. And those findings were echoed by a report by Maura Conway and colleagues, and that report's called Disrupting Daesh, and I can recommend that to you as well. So having done that first piece of work, we decided that as the next stage, we wanted to go a bit deeper and look in particular in more depth at the outlinks that we found in the tweets that we collected. So that's what I'm going to be presenting to you now. And before I turn to some of the data, I'll just give a quick word on the methodology. We collected the data for the study using a platform that had been purpose-built by our Cardiff University colleagues. And to be included in the data set, a tweet had to satisfy 5 conditions. So the first condition, the tweet had to mention the word Ramaya, which is the name of the magazine that we were interested in. Second, the tweet must have been posted within 21 days of the release of a new issue of the magazine. Third, the tweet must have been posted from an account that used the English language interface. Fourth, it must have contained original content, so we weren't looking at retweets. And fifth, it must have contained an outlink. So those were the 5 inclusion criteria. The resultant data set covered 9 issues of Ramaya magazine. It contained a total of 11,520 posts. And these posts between them contained 892 distinct outlinks. And the posts were posted by 1,493 different users. So I'll run through some of the key stages of analysis. So the first stage, we looked at the host names that were found in the outlinks. And you can see on the screen the top 10 by 3 different ways of counting. So in total, the posts that we collected contained 244 different host names. And here you have the top 10 by 3 different counts. First, by number of posts containing the host name. Then in the middle, the number of distinct links containing the host name. And finally, on the right, the number of distinct users that outlink to it. And there are 3 points I'd like to highlight. First point, the prevalence of file sharing sites and smaller platforms. So if you look at the left-hand count, the count by number of posts, 9 of the top 10 there are file sharing sites. The only one that isn't is the one at the top, ref.gl, and I'll say more about that in a moment. Then the right-hand count, the number of users, again, 9 of the top 10 are file sharing sites. The only one that isn't is pc.cd, and again, I'll come back to that in just a moment. Second point, still looking at the right-hand columns, notice the high suspension rate for these users. If you add up the different numbers in the different rows, you'll find that the suspension rate is 99.3%. And so this strongly suggests that those that are sharing these outlinks are promoting terrorism. Hence, they're being suspended. And then the third point, going back to ref.gl, which is at the top of 2 of our counts. Well, this apparently is a URL shortener, which is known as Refi botnet, and it's commonly used in networks of ill intent. And it was found in nearly 1/3 of the posts in our data set. And yet these 3,733 posts came from just 9 user accounts. And in fact, one of those accounts only posted it once. So in effect, this large number of posts came from just 8 accounts. The tweets containing the Refi botnet were posted following the last 4 issues of Ramaya magazine, and they were posted at an average rate of more than 50 posts a day. A few months after we completed the study, in April 2018, all accounts using the Refi botnet were suspended by Twitter. And then turning to pc.cd on the right-hand count, this also seemed connected to botnet activity. This host name appeared in 160 tweets. All were posted in the space of 25 hours by 102 distinct user accounts whose usernames were all randomized collections of letters, and all of these accounts were suspended. So I think this point goes back to one of the points Paul made in his presentation just now about the importance of behavior-based decisions to remove content. Moving on to the second stage of analysis. So here we looked at the content that could be found at the links. So we determined this mainly by clicking on the link and seeing where it took us. But where the link no longer worked, we relied instead on the text of the URL and the text of the post. And there are 2 points I want to highlight from this table. First, if you look at the relevant rows, you'll see there were 381 outlinks that led to a PDF of Ramaya magazine. Of these, 307 were no longer available, 59 were behind a subscription requirement or password protection, and just 15 led directly to a PDF of the magazine. And I'll say more about these 15 links in just a moment. It's worth pointing out that these 381 outlinks appeared in the total of 6,808 tweets, and those 6,808 tweets received only 800 retweets. So that's 8.5 tweets for every 1 retweet. The other point to note from this table is that 322 outlinks led to reports or information about Ramaya magazine. And some of the stories at these outlinks raised concerns, we felt, about the role of the traditional news media in amplifying and sharpening the message contained in the magazine itself. So to give an example, issue 1 of Ramaya contained an item that encouraged readers to kill disbelievers in the street. Even, it said, the flower seller. And as part of this item, there was a picture of a flower seller. No mention of the seller's name or location. The picture had apparently been found randomly on the internet. But the outlink that we followed in the post we collected took us to a story in the UK's Metro newspaper. This news item was about this article in Ramaya magazine. And the newspaper article named the flower seller and said where his flower store could be found. So this, I think, raises questions about the role of the traditional news media, and these concerns are also evident in the reaction to the Christchurch attack. Final stage, very briefly. These are the 15 outlinks to currently available PDFs of Ramaya. And when I say currently available, I'd like to point out, I mean currently available at the time we clicked. Google has taken down the link on there to Google Drive after we notified them of it. So 2 very brief points to finish from this table. First of all, you'll see that there were 12 users that posted one of these links but were not suspended. And this, I want to say, is not suggestive of any failing on Twitter's part. Twitter's rules prohibit the promotion of violent extremist groups. And having looked at the posts and those 12 users, they were not, in our interpretation, promoting the magazine or Islamic State itself. So they did not violate Twitter's terms of service. And then finally, there are 5 links on there to academic or research repositories, one from the Clarion Project, one from a site maintained by the researcher Peter van Oystien, and 3 links to jihadology. And jihadology, as you may be aware, has recently been amended so that some of the most egregious content on that site is now behind password requirement. And this followed months of pressure from some stakeholders, including the UK government. So those were some of our headline findings, and I'll leave it there for now.
So Paul, why don't you come back up here, and we'll start off with some questions that I just generally have for you, and then after that we'll take it to the audience for your questions. So Stuart, I found your research very interesting, especially looking at all of the different file sharing platforms that groups are using, especially that they're not really looking so much at academic research, which just goes to show you that these papers we spend years on really don't get read by many people, including the people that we're researching. So there you go. But you were saying that some of the main host names of these file sharing sites are, this idea that they do remove, these file sharing sites are removing the content, and certain groups or certain companies like JustPaste and archive.org got really quick at taking things down a couple of years ago when they saw that groups like ISIS were using their platforms. But maybe this can go to you too as well, Paul, because you looked at this as well. But what does this mean for smaller companies? We're going to have new tech companies coming up all the time as technology develops. And as we've heard earlier in this conference, some of them maybe only have a team of a couple of people. So how does this play out in the real world?
I think it also goes back to a point Ali made in his presentation when he talked about the ecosystem, and he distinguished beacons, aggregators, and content stores, and emphasized how important content stores are as part of the overall ecosystem. So being able to maintain the content on these file sharing sites does help ensure the resilience, as Ali said, of the content itself. So in terms of what we can do about it, first of all, I think we found 244 different host names, and GIFCT membership at the moment stands at 14. So I think there's a challenge there in terms of seeing what we can do practically to try and assist companies to become GIFCT members. Erin, in her opening comments, identified some of the challenges there are around companies having the capacity even to get to the stage where they're eligible for GIFCT membership. So I think this is somewhere where we can be looking to assist these companies. We tend to talk about assisting the companies to regulate their platforms, but assisting them also to get to the point where they can actually be eligible to join the GIFCT in the first place. And then a second initiative, which, again, Erin mentioned the hash sharing database earlier. There's also been work more recently that's begun on a URL sharing list. And I think one of the takeaways from our presentation is the importance of sharing URLs across platforms as well as sharing the hashes of content itself.
Yeah, I think Stuart got everything that I wanted to say, but I think it's not just just to reiterate the point again, that this isn't a problem that's just specific to social media and online companies, right? This kind of whole thing about how to triage a sort of multiplicity of risks and sort of prioritize particular areas and make those assessments and trying to formulate why you think particular types of behaviors and content is risky. It's something that's been done across the board and across a whole heap of organizations looking at issues to do with insider threat, issues to do with sort of client-based, general risk assessments. So there's lots of learning that could be, imported from those other spheres into your big social media organizations and your little ones too.
Paul, I would say this question is probably good for you, considering the research you just presented. So we have all of this talk about taking down content, and a lot of governments are calling for content to be taken down in a pretty quick amount of time. So, the realistic aspect of this, is it possible, is it not? But let's talk about automation detection versus human detection. And you mentioned this. Can we have one without the other? Once again, bigger companies can hire a lot more people to do this, smaller companies not so much. So let's talk about this.
Okay, so I think the sort of take-home understanding that we have of it and from general violence risk assessment is that if you're facing a lot of noise and a lot of potential things that you have to sift through and make your assessments of, that's when the sort of machine is at its best, right? To sort of triage and sort of prioritize to say, if you can only look at 5%, these are the 5% that we are interested in based on these types of behaviors, right? And obviously, there's a lot of back-end research that needs to be done to make sure that those behaviors are some way sort of predictive of the kind of risk that you're trying to specify. And then it's really then that the humans start to come in, right? So the machines have sort of pushed these ones up to the top of the list, and that's when you can go in and do stuff. So there's lots of really good work being done with partners over in Norway and Israel looking at, can they pick out like school shooter manifestos out of lengthy sort of angry diaries of teenagers that didn't, go towards violence. And they can say that, well, all of their school shooter texts have fallen into the top 10 to 15%, right? So it sort of reduces a lot of the noise, but that's when the sort of humans have to come in because they get the sort of finer, detailed, kind of more granular level understanding of cultural specificity or humor or the satire that's going into what's being actually said there. So it's a mixture between the two. They're sort of specifying different types of risks and triaging at very different parts of the process itself.
Stuart, so you found that some of these links that were being posted on Twitter were going to traditional news media outlets that weren't necessarily promoting the content, but they saw that there was a good story about a new Dabik or Rumia. For you, it was Rumia. That's what you looked at. But an issue with content in it that was newsworthy. Yet actors, in this case terrorist actors, decided to use these links to traditional media to also promote their words and their cause. There's a very controversial idea of the contagion effect or contagion theory, this idea that the more news or media that promotes something, the more effects we'll see in the future of that. What are your thoughts on maybe the ethics that traditional media should look at, as well as how it helps or also hinders this idea of taking down content?
And as I said in the presentation, the Christchurch attack raises exactly the same concerns about the role of the traditional news media. Attack Against Terrorism produced an analysis of the aftermath of the attack on social media. And one of the key points in their findings, I think, is, according to their research, the video of the attack only went viral after it had been shared online by two UK-based tabloid newspapers, the Daily Mail and the Daily Mirror. And so these two newspapers had seems like a causal effect in causing it to be so widespread in the way it was. So they're important issues. I suppose one point I'd make is that we sometimes talk about old and new media, and it's becoming more and more unsustainable to talk in those terms. We're looking here at what some might call old media, but they're using the new media to share their work. And actually, if we're thinking about regulation, my opinion would be that there's a good argument that says the same standard should apply across all of these different branches of the media, and it doesn't make sense to suggest that there should be different standards, whether one's old media or new media. And also happening in the UK at the moment, there is a lot of talk about imposing regulation on online harms. I think it's interesting that the newspaper industry is already regulated, and as we talk about regulation of online harms, I think it would be wise, as Paul's already suggested, we need to look to contexts where things have been done previously and what can we learn from them. So we can maybe look at some of the regulatory structures that are in place for news media and learn some lessons there that we can then apply if we're going to continue the discussion about regulation of online harms.
Paul, is there anything you'd like to add to that? No? So many of us know that we've had this big summit that we're seeing in France this week. Christchurch has come up a lot in this conference and, of course, in a lot of talks on this topic lately. You know, there's a lot of calls being made for quick content removal, regulations of the internet and social media and so forth. And while we understand where they're all coming from, there's this huge problem of free speech, and of course you're in the First Amendment, and you know, not wanting to regulate so much that we're taking away the freedoms that people have in different countries, and every country has different laws, of course, on this. But what are both of your thoughts in this sphere of trying to battle content, but also trying to create spaces where it's not going to be taking away free speech and so forth?
Stuart's the lawyer, so he's best placed, I think.
It's a big question.
Well, one thing I'd like to say about the free speech debate, we sometimes talk in terms of security being balanced against liberty. I think as we talk about these issues, we need to be careful not to continue to propagate this idea, because it is overly simplistic. You have some speech that is not protected. It wouldn't be protected speech under the First Amendment, and it certainly wouldn't be protected by the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 10, right to freedom of expression. And that's because of the underlying purpose for which the speech is being published. If it's being published with the purpose of encouraging terrorism, then my understanding is it loses its entitlement to being protected speech. And then more importantly, the flip side of that is the importance of freedom of speech in counter-terrorism strategy. And when you juxtapose the two, you can lose sight of that. Free speech is fundamentally important in efforts to counter terrorism. We should be encouraging ideological debate. And so that would be the other part of my answer.
I think for me, if we're thinking about the sort of spectrum of different kind of content that's pushed out by violent extremist groups, I don't really see it as a bit of a grey zone. I don't mind the content so much that's trying to sell the message and trying to sell the utopia and trying to sell the idea. It's when it crosses towards giving people the impetus to move towards violence and the tools to do so, that's when it's absolutely very clear that there needs to be, somebody needs to step in. And, you know, we often talk about this thing, online radicalization, like, in the vast majority of cases, there's a sort of fairly healthy offline sphere to it too, right? So it's not just on social media organizations to be sort of in this space and managing it. Sometimes maybe the fact that they're spending a lot of time online and being socially isolated and just dealing with the radicalizing materials, maybe that's what's filling their day, and they're not sort of going to go off and do something else, right? Sometimes it might actually protect it against them, sort of going that next step further. So I think it isn't this sort of
ever this easy, clean-cut yes/no question. Again, going back to, I think when we're thinking about content removal, often the question seems to be keep up or remove, right? Whereas often when you're doing a sort of real risk assessment of an individual, there's a sort of much greater degree of disruption opportunities you have at your disposal, right? So sometimes it's not just about thinking about the presence of a behavior or presence of a feature in a radicalizing piece of content, but actually thinking about sort of going beyond that, like what is its relevance to the target population? So not every message will be created equally, so we have to sort of find different management strategies out of it. So yeah.
So one thing I want to bring up, because this is more my realm, is a lot of the research is done on Twitter and Facebook and platforms that are fairly open. But as we know, especially with the crackdown on Twitter, 2016, if I'm correct, a lot of groups, including ISIS, have moved to encrypted platforms. So what does that mean for this type of research? We are also seeing the same type of file sharing dissemination on the encrypted platforms, where they just flood it with different locations that you can get a video or a document. So there's similarities in the ecology of how they disseminate information, but there's also differences. So what are your thoughts on this? And I see, Ali, you're back, so you're more than welcome to jump in if you can hear us on these questions.
Sorry, I slightly snoozed off. Yes. On that particular question, I would say, well, there's obviously, we focus on jihadist groups. They're very comfortable using, particularly Telegram. Yeah, it's encrypted, but getting to those groups, you've just got to be able to get to those groups the same as their supporters do. It's not impossible. It's just a question of experience and expertise and linguistic ability. Certainly Twitter did a lot to remove stuff, but it didn't hurt that Telegram came along at the time that it did. It certainly didn't hurt Twitter's effort to get them to move away, because a lot of the reports that came out 2015, 2016 about how there was a decrease in content on Twitter was pretty much just they went to use Telegram because Telegram served them better. Some of it is disruption, some of it is just Telegram is just so much better for them. The file sharing size is much bigger, the video size is much bigger. The transfer happened as soon as Telegram started using or enabling broadcast, so large-scale group broadcast. And full end-to-end, you can have person-to-person voice call versus massive groups Twitter style at the other end. So it is partly a question of disruption and partly a question of it becoming slightly obsolete to spend their whole time dealing with their core group on Twitter. They went to Telegram because their core group was much happier with the service. It's always worth balancing those two things when we think about the successes of disruption. There wasn't a lot of effort on Twitter's part and other things, but it's always a balance between what's useful and what is what's useful and what is practical to be done versus wouldn't it be nice if they just all went and used something that no one else used. On the link sharing aspect, once you can penetrate the groups, it's easy to take the links and share them with everyone else. Just a tech question at that point. That can be done.
Paul, Stuart?
I think from our perspective, being based at university, it's a little bit different. And really differ. So I know one particular university in the south of England didn't allow its researchers to even deal with Twitter stuff. So and I know there's other ones where there's a sort of huge reluctance to allow researchers to work on Telegram. I know there's some in the audience that have even managed to do it. Emil Bloom there. sort of by putting in the kind of right protocols and data storage and all those other kind of absolutely necessary things to sort of protect the researchers as much as anything. I think there's the other thing that as kind of researchers and PIs we need to be sort of conscious of is having, you know, research assistants and other people kind of working on Telegram and looking at this kind of fairly, what can be very harrowing material on a day-to-day basis can sort of create harm. So there's also those kind of things that ourselves as researchers and social media organizations have to be very sort of cognizant of as well.
And I just want to add that you can see exactly the same dynamic with radical right. So again, there's migration from major platforms to smaller ones, and the same issues around researcher welfare when researching these groups on smaller platforms can raise quite acute issues around researcher welfare that need to be addressed for the research to be permissible from a university's point of view.
And the use of those kind of encrypted platforms for the extreme right in the UK has also really sort of changed the kind of dynamic of the threat itself. So, you know, when we were doing work 5-6 years ago, looking at police data on the extreme right-wing guys, they were largely very socially isolated, no contact between each other. But now you kind of got this fairly impressive kind of network of individuals plotting fairly kind of complex attacks within the UK, and it's all sort of very much facilitated by the affordances given by those kind of encrypted networks themselves. So again, the behavioral footprint of those guys and their abilities to turn towards violence has just sort of dramatically changed because of that affordance.
So we're going to open up questions to the audience now. And remember, if you're on Twitter, you can follow the conversation at #Terrorism and Tech. And you will see people coming down the aisle with a microphone. Please raise your hand if you have a question. And then before you ask your question, if you could let us know who you are, where you're from, that would be fantastic. So I'm opening up to questions now.
Thank you so much. I'm Tamar Metz. I'm a professor at Columbia University. So my question is about the Rumia study. One of the interesting things for me is whether different types of content are being shared on different platforms or URLs. So if you were to do the same study you did on a different magazine or a different type of video, would you find the similar sites being used, or would they be other types of sites?
The other aspect I think that's interesting to me is language aspect. So we looked at the English language interface because, well, practical reasons essentially. Would you see the same kinds of findings if you were looking at a different language interface? Would the platform be as effective? And there's some firm shakes of the head in the front here. So the language aspect is important. And something else that I think speaks to your question, we did a similar thing for Dabiq issue 15, and the number of posts about that one issue was greater than for all 9 issues of Rumia together. So, but for Dabiq issue 15, the majority of posts were actually coming from non-Islamic State sympathizers. The theme of that particular issue was Break the Cross, and it was very much targeted at the Christian church. And it really sparked a reaction, and there was a lot of posts then from a certain kind of profile type that really took exception to the contents of the magazine and made it far more salient as a result. So we talked about the role of the traditional media in raising awareness of terrorist propaganda. In that particular instance, it wasn't news media, it was individuals of a particular political persuasion that were outraged by it and talking about it a lot and actually sharing links to it, saying, look at this is horrific, this is outrageous, signposting people to it so they could look for themselves.
Thank you. I mean, I've talked to all of you before, and it's always good to just, every time you guys present, I have more questions and more help that I think the tech companies need. I want to get a baseline of the fact that you were all looking at content that leads to quote-unquote terrorist content. and we all kind of use this term blanket about quote-unquote terrorist content. And there's a huge difference between an image of a guy with a beard in the desert and a tech company that is supposed to just inherently know that that's a foreign terrorist fighter. Could just be a hipster in a desert. We don't. There's an entire WordPress that I think it's like hipster or jihadist. And so there's one thing around branded content, the worst of the worst, beheading videos, known content of perpetrator-created content. At Facebook, we have over 200 people just on counterterrorism and 30,000 people on security and operations. And they have to have language qualifications and they have to have subject matter expertise. That's advanced a lot just in the last 2 years. When we talk to Just Paste It, which is one lovely, brilliant guy in Poland who is trying to take down government requests when they are flagging things to him, but the oversight's really difficult. How are we, as academics, how do we give better insights of how to know what is terrorist content? Again, outside of Daesh and Al-Qaeda, there's going to be a lot of dispute. But when you guys are saying this led to terrorist content, what are the indicators that we can give other tech companies for them to just know, even with human review, yes, you're right, that's not just a guy in the desert, that's the glorification of a foreign terrorist fighter that's giving instructions on how to join an entity that's on a DTO list?
Well, being UK-based, the first place I'd look is the UK statutory definition of terrorism, which is deliberately over-inclusive. In fact, in some cases before the Supreme Court, counsel for the Home Office has gone so far as to say it is deliberately over-inclusive because that gives us the flexibility we need. So that flexibility, on the one hand, is helpful when answering a question like this, because it means that what I've talked about very clearly does fall within the definition, but the negatives are that if you have something that's over-inclusive, it then creates a discretion, and there's an element of selection then. If too much falls within this definition, which ones are we going to select to take action against? And this in itself can create a perception in some communities that they're being targeted or singled out. Again, going back to the kind of interplay between jihadist groups and the radical right, there are far more attention has focused on the jihadist groups, although the radical right also falls quite clearly within the UK statutory definition. One of my colleagues at Swansea, Elizabeth Pearson, has followed Twitter communities, and they've talked about their reaction to being suspended on Twitter, and it's almost it's something that's used. They might be suspended, and then they'll go back onto their platform saying, "I was suspended," and it's almost like a badge of honour, a sign that's used to try and create solidarity. We've been banned from the platform, and kind of strengthens the bonds. So there is this downside to having an overly broad definition as well.
So I think the big problem that you have is when you're looking at sort of beliefs and attitudes, right? Because they're very sort of group specific, context specific, culturally specific. And by the time you've sort of cracked all of your knowledge on beliefs and attitudes on a particular group, they ebb away and another group pops up, and then you have to sort of relearn from scratch again. Or a sort of new jihadi group pops up, or a new violent movements like the incels pop up, or targeted individuals are another sort of growing movements of people stepping over the line into violence. So I'd focus, because I'm not too worried about radicalization, right? People can be as radical as they want, but just don't be violent about it. Be a radical Liverpool fan. It's a terrible life choice, but just don't be violent about it, right? So when you start focusing on the violence and the tools to get you to the place where you can step over the line, cross that threshold and do violence on behalf of a movement, whatever it is. So when your ideology blinds, those things are sort of, you'll have a diffusion of benefits across different ideologies when it's about showing people the tools, techniques, procedures you need to be able to build a bomb, stab somebody better. Because we know from like Donald Holbrook's work, where he's looked at the computers of people convicted of terrorism act offences, the extreme right, they'll just learn from anybody. They'll read jihadi text to learn how to sort of build a bomb better or whatever it is. There's lots of pollination there. So I'd focus more on the sort of violent aspect of it, and be right now, as a sort of to prioritise your resources, and not to worry too much about the sort of radicalizing content. Very few people are going to step over the line and do violence, but that's really what we should be concerned about, right? So that'll be my 2 cents.
Yes, we have the gentleman over here in the...
Hi, Carl Gollivan, a retired special agent, U.S. Customs, 9/11 responder, domain reference, and ideal, liveson.net. I have a question for you really about the UK in a historical perspective. I asked an earlier question about how covert operations or intelligence activities sometimes overlap and intersect with actual independent radical terrorist activity. Recalling conversations by a member of Parliament, last name Blackheath, I recall that pointing towards it being understood MI5 and MI6 actually managed or controlled at the top levels the IRA back during its most active period of time. Can you clarify whether that's true? Is it recognized now that MI5 and MI6 were doing that?
Is it because I'm Irish? Yeah, so there was some fairly high-level individuals, one with the codename Steak Knife that was apparently very sort of high up in IRA decision-making. So there's certainly, it's certainly a part of the current dissident Irish Republican message that a part of the sort of provisional IRA's fall was because they'd been so heavily infiltrated by British forces that sort of pulled them towards a peace process. So, and there's certainly a belief system that it's there, but whether it's true or not, I'm Irish, I don't know.
Anyone else want to take that question? No? Ali, you're still there, so... No. We still have time for questions in the audience, so I see a gentleman in the middle over here. If you could put your hand up higher, so yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Larry Checco, Senior Advisor to Serve USA. I'm assuming that the ultimate goal here is to curtail terrorism. Terrorism is a two-way street, and I would ask, are there any studies being done on the spike in technology use after collateral damage? I'm not so sure I'm making myself clear here, but it seems like every time the United States goes into a coalition kind of operation with another organization and collateral damage happens to innocent people, especially children, is there a spike in the technical use of the media? Yeah, am I making myself clear?
Let me see if I can clarify it. So are you saying that just the use of new technologies, media of the internet, that when there are attacks that, or collateral damage, as you said, so something that might kill a lot of children or something, that you're seeing increase of media use, or are you talking about increase of content that is related to that attack?
Both. Is there
Both.
a correlation between, you know, the type of content and the spread of that content in the exponential enlargement of terrorism?
So there's a study ongoing right now by colleagues at King's College London that's basically trying to answer that particular question. They haven't published it yet, so it hasn't gone through peer review, but the sort of initial tentative findings suggest that there is a kind of relationship, that there's a spike in communications in the aftermath of a counter-terrorism action that led to many civilians being killed. There's also been some work done on drone strikes in Pakistan and fatalities caused by allied forces in Iraq and Afghanistan that show that there's a sort of this very close temporal spike in violence immediately after those kind of large-scale fatal counter-terrorism actions on the civilian populace as well. So.
And more generally, it certainly feeds into the propaganda that the groups may try to disseminate. So if you look through Dabiq or Ramaya magazine, you'll find pieces that talk about Western foreign policy, talk about Western airstrikes, and they have pictures that they claim are victims of Western airstrikes. So it feeds into the narrative that seeks to radicalize.
I'll add too that on Telegram, when there is an attack of some sort, whoever is responsible for it, if they want to put the blame on the coalition or the West, there's definitely pictures of killed children, burnt women, and so forth. It's usually the women and children, and then the fighters are glorified, and the women and children are victims, which is interesting. Ali, do you want to add anything? No.
I'd just say that they do have plenty of genuine footage of dead children. They don't have to invent it. So they do share it as part of the content. In fact, they video what phosphorus coming down on them as well. So there's certainly an element of recording what's going on, but you remember that the audience they're talking to is very often connected with other communities that are in the region. So they often have experienced some of those same things. It's important to recognise that those things do happen as much as there are times when different explanations or disagreements about who fired it are. I think the experience of trying to retake Mosul, where the reports from the soldiers that were coming out were worse than the claims that ISIS were making beforehand about their level of civilian casualties, is important to bear in mind. On the earlier question, I think Aaron asked, one of the most important things is getting to grips with the content, is actually what the content means. We tend to talk about what it looks like to Westerners, not what jihadis are trying to say through it. I think that probably the most important thing is what they're trying to communicate to an audience that lives in a similar socio-cultural environment that is almost always not where the researchers are comfortably living. So understanding it from that perspective is important. Things that people in those environments will easily recognize that most Western researchers will look past and just think it's just a bit of the background, is an important part of interpreting those images. It's not an accident there's lots of trees appearing in the backs of those images, but we very rarely, if you look at Western terrorism literature about jihadis, you see any mention of what the tree is doing there. So understanding the content is part of understanding what is the point, although, yeah, bearded person in desert isn't particularly.
So,
sorry, Chelsea.
no, you're good. You're good. We have one more question time for, and Chris, I saw your hand up, so this will be our last question.
Hi, I'm Munira Mustafa from American University. Just a quick nerdy question, actually, for Stuart. I'm quite interested in your selection criteria. You might have clarified this, I might have missed it, but could you tell me why the 21-day instead of... I'm just curious about the selection criteria. Thank you.
It was really just because of the aims of the study. So we wanted to look at that initial drive to try and disseminate the magazine post-publication. And so we chose to just look at a 3-week window. There wasn't any overlap. And actually the report, when it's published in a few weeks, it gives the time and date of the start and finish of the collection for each individual issue. So
I've been told we do have time for Chris's question over here, so it's good.
Thank you again for the great presentations. My question would be for Ali and for Stuart. And I think both of you did a really great job laying out effectively like the network architecture to some extent of how content is stored versus distributed. My question would be, how unique do you think that is to jihadist networks versus, say, like far-right? You know, we're going to hear a little bit more later today about some far-right research on far-right tech and terrorism, and I'd be curious for your intuitive thoughts on how generalizable your findings are.
Who wants to take this question first? Ali, Stuart?
Chuck, I can start. Jihadis are driven by the their experience, so their specific architecture is probably specific to them. But I think the general ideas about what functions as a beacon and content stores and aggregators probably fits more broadly into some of the other categories. The specific architecture of jihadis is a result of pressure, so it's much more distributed than our normal Western social media use. In that sense, it probably is largely specific, but the categories I think we would think would work or worth testing more broadly.
In terms of our particular study, when we set out and we designed it, we didn't actually make a decision to limit the study to jihadist groups. The bigger study that we completed looked at 4 different jihadist groups, 5 magazines in total. But we decided we would look at online magazines published by a designated terrorist group using the UK's list of terrorist organisations. And it just so happened that the only groups that published online magazines were jihadist groups. So radical right groups may have had transcripts of speeches or manifestos or flyers, but not magazines. So that's the reason they weren't included. Studying magazines actually made it easier to identify which posts should be in the data set and which shouldn't. And I think when you start to move to other media formats, and in particular given the prevalence of user-generated comment, and I think it would have posed more difficulties in terms of clearly identifying which tweets should have been included and which shouldn't. And as you get into the realm of user-generated content and so on, then I think some of the questions we've been discussing become, such as content removal, become a lot more difficult. Something we haven't thrown into the conversation yet is that lots of jihadist group propaganda is branded, which aids the automated removal, whereas a lot of the radical right propaganda is not branded, which makes it more difficult then for automated processes to pick it up. So that was kind of the underlying thinking, and it was very much about the media format, online magazines, as opposed to a particular type of ology.
Well, that wraps it up for our panel on capabilities, and I want to thank everyone for coming. There is going to be a bit of a break, and lunch will be served, so if you want to partake in lunch, if you go out the doors in the back, there'll be lunch, and we'll see you back after that. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.